Welcome to Hot Boys Garage episode 22. This one is going to be the first video in a 4-part series where I go through some of the steps I take when assembling a new engine combination. The first video is going to cover initial rough measurements and a cylinder mock-up. The next video is going to cover how to measure piston to cylinder wall clearance. The third video will cover piston rings and how to gap rings. And the fourth and final video will cover a few miscellaneous things like piston to oil squirter clearance, honing a cylinder, clocking rings, and just some other little tips and considerations. All in all, I'll be going through the process of putting together a somewhat new engine combination and completing the mock-ups and measurements that I like to do to ensure everything fits the way that it should and so that the engine lives a long life. A lot of what I'll cover will also be applicable to stock rebuilds or even if you just want to check your existing parts. As always, I'll put a table of contents in the video description. That way YouTube can break the video up into sections and you can skip to certain parts that you're interested in. I'll also put links to each of the 4 videos in this 4-part series in the video description. Okay, so this particular build is for a 2006 Honda TRX450R engine. The bottom end is going to have a stock length stroke crankshaft with an aftermarket connecting rod that is also stock length. And then the top end includes a larger aftermarket piston and cylinder, of which the size required us to bore the cases so it'd fit. This video series is going to be specific to that engine, that combination, and that setup, but much of what we go over can be applied to many other engines too. And a quick note, this build does not utilize a crank with a larger stroke than stock or a longer rod than stock. So I won't cover things like case trenching or long versus short rod comparisons, or tall cylinders and spacer plates, or like the compression height of the piston and the ringland placement on the piston. Stroker cranks and long rods are great, but really they open a whole nother can of worms. And for that I'd want to cover things like rod to stroke ratio, using a smaller big end bearing and pin, and how all of this affects your overall stack height. And then you got to get into things like longer cam chains and how all the tolerances on the different parts can end up adding up and affect your deck height and how you can deal with that. So we'll save that for another video for another day. That said, let's jump into the first part. On a new build that has a lot of new parts, like this one, this particular build has a new crank, a new and larger piston, and a new and larger cylinder. I like to do some rough measurements just to make sure that I got all the right size parts. A lot of times these parts will come from several different shops, several different manufacturers, and before you get started, it's kind of nice to know that you're not going to have to stop in the middle of it and send one of these parts back to get the right size. To perform these initial rough measurements, all you need is a decent set of calipers, and really you don't even need that. First thing I like to do is take the new piston and the new cylinder and just make sure the piston is going to fit. So I'll gently place the piston down inside the cylinder. I square it up here and just make sure it fits. Make sure the piston is not too big, make sure the cylinder is not too big, make sure this piston is not real sloppy in here. And if it is a little bit too sloppy, if it feels like the cylinder might be too big or the piston might be too small, then you can use your calipers to pull a rough measurement of the inside of the cylinder and the outer diameter of the piston. Make sure that you measure the piston's outer diameter down near the bottom of the skirts because these pistons kind of taper up in size, and where you're going to get the most accurate measurement is down here at the bottom of the skirts. We'll go over how to measure the piston and the cylinder more accurately later on in the video, but that should be good enough for just an initial rough measurement to make sure this is going to work. Next, I'll take the wrist pin, make sure you lube it just a little bit with some oil. And I will slip it into the pin bore of the piston. Make sure it fits, make sure it'll go, make sure it slides nice, make sure it's not too sloppy. And again, if something doesn't feel right here, it's when your calipers come into play. You can grab them, pull a quick measurement on the OD of the pin and the inner diameter of the piston's pin bore. Next, I like to take the piston pin. And again, make sure you got a little bit of lubrication on it. You want to make sure it is going to slip into the small end of the rod. It should slide in easily and it should not be sloppy. Again, you can use your calipers to get a rough measurement here if something doesn't feel right. And then the last thing that I like to do is make sure the small end of the rod will actually go up inside of the piston and it has plenty of clearance side to side. I say this because some of the aftermarket rods have a really wide small end of the rod, and some aftermarket pistons have this undercrown is very tight here. We've actually had to put pistons on the mill and open this up a little bit so that the small end of the rod will fit in here and so that it has a little bit of clearance side to side. Now to take this one step further, and this isn't really a rough measurement, but I like to make sure the crank is not too wide, especially if this big end pin has been pressed out, rebuilt, new bearing put in, pressed back in, and welded. I like to make sure that these webs are not too far apart. To do that, I use a set of micrometers. This one in particular is 2 to 3 inches. And I'll take a measurement with it side to side, at the top, at the bottom, and then as close to the surface here that the bearing rides on as I can get. So I'll take those widths and I'll compare them to, say, like a stock crank. And I know for a 2006 and up TRX450R, these things should not really be any wider than 66 millimeters. So if it's much over that, then I know I've got an issue. And the last thing that I like to do, especially for cranks that have been welded, the big end has been welded like this one has, I'll take either a machinist square or a long machinist parallel, something that's very flat across the surface, and you want something that's going to be flat that's within like a thousandth of an inch. And I'll lay this across the flat part of the crank where it's over the welds, and I'll take a feeler gauge, and I like to use at least 5/1000ths of an inch feeler gauge, and I'll run it underneath the parallel above the welds to make sure this feeler gauge will go. I'll do this on both sides, all over the welds, just to make sure that those welds don't stick up past where the crank bearing is going to ride, because we don't want these welds to rub the crank bearings. And if you don't have any clearance between the bottom of your parallel and the top of that weld needs to be ground down some. And now it's on to the next step. On a new build, the next thing that I like to do on new build combinations that have a larger cylinder, usually plus 5 millimeters over what a stock cylinder is to make sure the cylinder will actually fit and sit all the way down on the cases to where the bottom of the cylinder mating surface sits flat on the top of the cases at the mating surface. And what comes into play here is usually whenever you have a larger cylinder, say plus 5 millimeters over or bigger, you have to send your cases out to machine shop and get the cases bored larger to accept the new larger cylinder. And then occasionally with a new cylinder or a new combination, you don't really know how long the skirts of the cylinder are, so they might stick too far down into the cases and hit something before they sit flat on the cases. And then that can easily be the case if say you've got material removed from the bottom of the cylinder to get your deck height correct. So if you've got material cut off the bottom of the cylinder, these skirts are going to sit further down inside the cases. So when I mock this up, I like to have the cylinder to case dowels and the water passage all installed. So I'll go ahead and put all those in there. You also need your head studs installed if you don't already have those. I prefer not to use a gasket here just to see how much clearance I really have. And then we'll go ahead and slip the cylinder over the studs. And onto the cases. And with this one I can already kind of tell that it's sitting flat. And get this a little closer to the camera so you guys can kind of see. But another thing you can do to really make sure that this thing is sitting flat is put some old wrist pins or little bushings like this, like I made out of aluminum, over the head studs. Put your nuts and washers on, and then you can snug those up, and you can take a feeler gauge and run it around the base to see if the feeler gauge will slip between the cases and the bottom of the cylinder. This one's pretty good to go, and again I like to do this with no base gasket just to make sure I've got plenty of squish room for the gasket. And then that way you know before you go any further if your cases need to be bored more. Sometimes when you get these back from a machine shop, there'll be like a little lip down in here. You can actually kind of clearance this yourself if it's just this last part down in here. I'm taking like a little tiny flap wheel on the end of like a 90-degree die grinder and just kind of cleaned it up there. If it's just barely not wanting to go, usually you can do that yourself. But if the cylinder won't even start to go down in there, you're likely going to have to send your cases out to get them bored a little further. And then one thing I will say is if your cylinder has had a good bit of material removed from the bottom, sometimes the stock height coolant sleeve or these stock height dowels here will be too long, and they'll actually bottom out inside the cases and then bottom out into the bottom of the cylinder and not let the cylinder seat down all the way. So if your cylinder didn't fit all the way down in there the first time, you can take those out, put your cylinder back on, see if it sits all the way down in there now. That way you know if you just need to cut down these dowels a little bit to allow the cylinder to sit all the way down. Now I can split these cases back apart and we can move on to the next step. That's a wrap for the first video in this 4-part series. Hopefully it was beneficial. Be sure to stay tuned and check out part 2 in the series where I'm going to cover how to measure your piston to cylinder wall clearance. A link to that video and the other videos in this 4-part series is going to be in the video description. So check it out, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel. Till next time, thanks for watching.